For decades, Donald Trump's mother, Mary Ann Trump, was remembered as a Scottish immigrant who married a successful New York builder and built a comfortable life for her family. But the documents behind that story reveal something far more complicated. She arrived in America with only about $50, married Fred Trump, nearly died after giving birth, and spent decades inside a powerful family where money, reputation, and control mattered enormously. By the end of her life, her own signature was connected to decisions involving a fortune worth far more than the public ever knew. The story of Mary Ann Trump did not begin with wealth, luxury, or the famous Trump name. It began thousands of miles away, on the remote Scottish island of Lewis, where life was hard and opportunities were limited. Born in 1912, Mary Ann was the youngest of 10 children. Her father worked as a crofter and fisherman, while the family lived in a community where Gaelic was spoken and traditions ran deep. For a young woman growing up there, the future could feel almost predetermined. Marriage, local work, or leaving the island were among the few paths available. But Mary Ann wanted something different. At just 18 years old, she boarded a ship bound for America. On the passenger records, her occupation was listed simply as domestic. She had around $50 with her and planned to remain in America permanently. She was not arriving as a wealthy traveler. She was an immigrant looking for a new life. That detail matters because the popular version of her story often makes her journey sound like a fairy tale. The reality was much more uncertain. Mary Ann went to live with relatives in Queens and spent years working in domestic service. She was surrounded by wealthy American households, but she was not part of that world. She worked inside it. Then, sometime in the 1930s, everything changed. At a social gathering in Queens, Mary Ann met Fred Trump, a young builder who was already making a name for himself in New York. Fred came from a family involved in construction, and his career was moving quickly. For Mary Ann, this meeting opened a door that could completely transform her life. But there was something she could not have known yet. She was not simply marrying a successful businessman. She was entering an ambitious family with its own rules, expectations, and power structure. And before long, the young Scottish immigrant who had crossed an ocean with almost nothing would find herself living inside that family, and playing a role far more complicated than anyone outside the household could see. When Mary Ann met Fred Trump in Queens, she was stepping into a world very different from the one she had left behind in Scotland. Fred was already building homes across Queens and Brooklyn, and his family had been involved in construction for years. He was ambitious, well-connected, and determined to expand his business. Mary Ann, meanwhile, had spent years working in domestic service. She knew what wealthy households looked like from the inside, but she had never truly belonged to that world. Then came the marriage. Their wedding in January 1936 was respectable but surprisingly small, with only about 25 guests. Mary Ann wore a white satin gown with a long train, and the ceremony took place at Madison Avenue Presbyterian Church in New York. From the outside, it looked like the beginning of an American success story. But the honeymoon lasted only 2 days. Fred and his new bride soon returned to New York, and Mary Ann moved into the home of Fred's mother, Elizabeth Christ Trump. This detail is easy to overlook, but it reveals something important about Mary Ann's new life. She had crossed an ocean hoping to build a future of her own. Now she was living in another woman's household, while her new husband continued building a business that was already shaped by his mother's influence. Elizabeth was not simply Fred's mother. She had played a major role in the family business and had helped keep it operating while Fred was still young. So Mary Ann had entered a powerful family structure almost immediately. And she had to find her place inside it. Within a few years, children began arriving. Mary Ann was born in 1937, followed by Fred Jr., Elizabeth, Donald, and Robert. The family was growing, and Fred's business was growing with it. But behind the comfortable image was a woman whose role was becoming much more demanding. Mary Ann was no longer the young immigrant who had arrived with $50. She was now the wife of a wealthy builder and the mother of 5 children. Yet one of the strangest parts of her story was still ahead. Because becoming wealthy did not mean she had escaped the kind of work she once performed for other people. In some ways, she was about to discover that her new life came with its own duties, and some of them would follow her for decades. Mary Ann's life had changed dramatically. The young woman who once worked in other people's homes was now living in a wealthy family of her own. But becoming Fred Trump's wife did not mean she suddenly stopped working. In fact, one story shows just how complicated her new position could be. Accounts of the family describe Mary Ann personally visiting some of the Trump family's apartment buildings and collecting coins from laundry machines. The exact details are disputed, with some accounts connecting the task to Fred's mother, Elizabeth, and others saying Mary Ann performed it. But the confusion itself tells us something important. The family business was not just Fred's responsibility. Everyone had a role. Marian's role was not limited to raising children and maintaining the family home. She became part of the machinery that helped the Trump family operate its growing property empire. And there was an almost unbelievable contrast in her life. She had arrived in America as an 18-year-old immigrant with about $50. Now she was driving a Rolls-Royce. But even that symbol of success had a strange connection to her daily duties. The same woman who represented wealth and status could also be connected to ordinary work like collecting laundry money from apartment buildings. It was a perfect example of how the family operated. Appearances mattered, but behind those appearances was constant work. Marian also became increasingly involved in the community. She supported charities, took part in hospital organizations, helped with causes involving children and people with disabilities, and became a visible member of New York society. This gave her a second identity. She was no longer simply Fred Trump's wife. She was becoming the polished public face of the family. But while Marian was building that public role, the private demands of family life were becoming heavier. By the 1940s, she had 5 children. The family was growing quickly, and Fred's business was expanding. The comfortable photographs could make it look like everything was going exactly according to plan. Then, in 1948, something happened that nearly ended Marian's life. She had just given birth to her youngest son, Robert. What followed was not another chapter in a success story. It was a medical crisis that would leave Marian permanently changed, and reveal how the Trump family responded when something could not simply be solved with money or business connections. In 1948, Marian's life changed in a way no wedding photograph or business success could hide. She had just given birth to her youngest child, Robert. Instead of returning home and beginning life with a newborn, Marian developed a severe medical crisis. She suffered a hemorrhage and required emergency surgery. Then another danger appeared, a serious infection that led to further operations. The situation became so serious that her family was told she might not survive. Her daughter Marianne was only 11 years old at the time. Years later, she remembered her father coming home and telling her that her mother was not expected to live. But there was another instruction. Go to school. For a child, that must have been difficult to understand. Her mother was seriously ill, yet life at home was expected to continue almost normally. But there is another side to this story. Fred Trump did not simply ignore what was happening. He used his connections and his position at Jamaica Hospital to find medical help. According to accounts of the event, he helped locate a surgeon connected with Columbia and moved quickly to get the treatment Marianne needed. So the picture is more complicated than simply saying Fred was cruel. He appeared to respond to the emergency in the way he understood best, through money, connections, organization, and action. But emotionally, the family seems to have handled the crisis very differently. Marianne survived. She was only 36 years old. But surviving did not mean returning to the life she had before. The operations left lasting problems, and her health remained fragile for years. She would never have another child. And now there were 5 children in the household, a growing business, and a mother who had nearly died. This was the moment when Marianne's role became even more important. She had to recover while continuing to raise her family and maintain the household's public image. Fred continued building his business. The children grew older. And the family moved forward. From the outside, the crisis disappeared into the past. But inside the family, it had revealed something important. When disaster arrived, the Trumps did not stop everything and fall apart. They kept moving. And that way of dealing with pain would appear again, years later, when another member of the family faced a tragedy that could not be fixed by money, connections, or business. Marianne survived the medical crisis, but her life did not become quiet. As the Trump family grew wealthier, she took on another role that would become central to the family's public identity. She became the woman people saw. Fred Trump was focused on buildings, property, and business. Marianne was increasingly involved in charity work and community events. She supported organizations connected with hospitals, children, people with disabilities, and other local causes. She also became involved with church and community activities. To many people, this looked like the perfect picture of a successful American family. A powerful businessman. A devoted wife. 5 children. A large home. And a mother who was active in charity. But there was another reason Marianne's public role mattered. Fred Trump's business was not always free from controversy. His involvement in federally backed housing projects brought him under government attention, and years later, the Trump family's property company faced allegations of racial discrimination in its apartment rentals. These events created problems for the family name. Marianne could not solve those problems. But she could help shape how the family was seen. She represented a softer side of the household. She appeared at charity events. She supported community causes. She built relationships outside the business world. While Fred was associated with construction and money, Mary Ann could be associated with family and charity. And this was not necessarily an act. Accounts of her life suggest that she genuinely cared about many of the causes she supported. She continued giving attention to Scotland as well, maintaining connections with people and places from her childhood. But there was something else happening inside the family. Her children were growing up. And they were beginning to develop very different ideas about what their futures should look like. The eldest son, Fred Jr., was expected to become part of his father's business. But he wanted something completely different. He dreamed of becoming a pilot. His father wanted a businessman. His son wanted to fly. That disagreement would become much more serious than a simple difference between a father and son. And eventually, it would expose one of the deepest problems inside the family: what happened when someone refused to follow the path Fred Trump had chosen for them. Mary Ann was caught in the middle. And the consequences would follow her for the rest of her life. As the Trump children grew older, Fred Trump had a clear idea of what success looked like. His business was growing, his properties were expanding, and he expected his children to understand the value of the empire he had built. For Fred Jr., however, that future did not feel right. He wanted to become a pilot. He eventually flew for TWA, and by many accounts, he was good at it. But his father wanted him in the family business. The disagreement became a source of tension, and Fred Jr. struggled with alcohol as his personal and professional life became more difficult. Mary Ann was watching all of this happen inside her own family. The son who had been expected to carry on his father's work was moving further away from it. Eventually, Fred Jr. returned to the family home in Jamaica Estates, where he performed maintenance work on his father's properties. It was a painful contrast. The family had money. The family had large homes and successful businesses. Yet one of its sons was struggling to find his own place. Then, in 1981, tragedy struck. Fred Jr. died from a heart attack at just 42 years old. Some details surrounding his final hours remain disputed. Different family members later gave different accounts of what happened, so it is important not to present every version as established fact. What is clear is that his death became one of the most painful events in the family's history. And for Mary Ann, this was not simply the loss of an adult son. She had nearly died giving birth to her youngest child decades earlier. She had raised 5 children. Now she was burying one of them. Yet the surviving accounts leave many unanswered questions about how the family dealt with that grief. That silence is important. The Trump family had built a system around business, money, image, and control. But grief did not fit neatly into that system. Fred Jr.'s death showed what could happen when a family member could not follow the path that had been planned for him. And Mary Ann was still there, watching the family change around her. But her most shocking chapter had not yet arrived. Years later, when Mary Ann was already elderly, something happened on a Queen Street that would leave her seriously injured. There were only $14 in her handbag. And that seemingly small detail would eventually become part of Donald Trump's own public story. By the early 1990s, Mary Ann Trump was already an elderly woman. She had lived through more than half a century of marriage, raised 5 children, survived a life-threatening medical crisis, and watched her family become increasingly wealthy and powerful. Then, on October 31, 1991, something happened that left her seriously injured. Mary Ann was shopping near a supermarket in Queens when a teenager attacked her and took her handbag. Inside were only about $14. The amount was small. The consequences were not. Mary Ann suffered serious injuries, including broken ribs, a brain hemorrhage, and lasting problems with her sight and hearing. The woman who had spent decades presenting a strong public image was suddenly vulnerable in a way the family could not simply hide behind wealth. A man named Lawrence Herbert reportedly witnessed the incident and chased after the attacker. He recovered Mary Ann's handbag and helped return it to her. The teenager was eventually arrested. But the story did not end there. Donald Trump later used what happened to his mother as part of his public discussion about crime and safety in New York. The incident became more than a family tragedy. It became a story connected to his views about law, order, and the dangers facing ordinary people. And that transformation is important. Mary Ann had spent much of her life being seen through other people's stories. She was Fred Trump's wife. She was Donald Trump's mother. She was the Scottish immigrant who became wealthy. But for a brief moment, she was simply an elderly woman who had been hurt on a Queen Street. And the attack left permanent consequences. There was another reason this period of her life matters. The early 1990s were also the years when the Trump family's financial affairs were becoming increasingly complicated. Behind the scenes, money was moving between family members, businesses, properties, and trusts. Mary Ann was still alive. Still involved. And her name was connected to documents that would later become extremely important. The woman who had once arrived in America with $50 was now living inside a family fortune worth vastly more. And then the paperwork began telling a story that photographs never could. The story takes an even more complicated turn in the 1990s, because Mary Ann was no longer simply connected to the Trump family through marriage. Her name appeared in financial arrangements involving the family fortune. One company became especially important, All County Building Supply and Maintenance. According to the source material, All County was presented as a business that supplied equipment and services for the Trump family's apartment buildings. But later reporting raised serious questions about how the company actually worked. Purchases made for the properties were allegedly marked up before the costs were passed along. That detail matters because the money did not simply disappear. It moved through a system involving members of the Trump family. Later investigations reported that these arrangements helped transfer substantial wealth to family members while also affecting the financial records of the family's properties. The Trump family's lawyers disputed allegations of wrongdoing, making the story more complicated than a simple accusation of criminal behavior. But then came the documents. In the mid-1990s, Fred and Mary Ann Trump took part in estate and trust arrangements that transferred control and wealth to their children. The value placed on the family's assets became a major issue years later when journalists examined the records. And this is where Mary Ann's role becomes impossible to ignore. She was not merely standing in the background while Fred handled everything. Her signature appeared on important documents. That does not automatically prove that she understood every detail of the financial arrangements, nor does it prove that she personally designed them. But it does establish something important: she was formally involved. The woman who had once arrived in America as a young domestic worker had become part of a family financial structure involving enormous sums of money. And the timing was striking. Mary Ann was already in her later years. She had suffered serious injuries from the 1991 attack and was dealing with lasting health problems. Yet her name remained connected to decisions involving the family fortune. Then, in 2019, a major investigation by the New York Times brought many of these old financial records back into public view. The investigation examined how Fred Trump had transferred wealth to his children and raised questions about the taxes paid on those transfers. The Trump family disputed the newspaper's conclusions. But the documents had already created a problem that could not easily be erased. They showed that the family's wealth was not simply the result of Donald Trump building his own fortune from nothing. There was a much larger family story behind it. And Mary Ann, the immigrant mother who had once seemed like the quietest figure in that story, was connected to the paperwork. But there was still one thing the documents could not fully explain. Who was Mary Ann Trump when nobody was watching? The answer may have survived in a place nobody in the family could control: letters written decades earlier by a Scottish girl who had not yet married Fred Trump. For all the documents, photographs, financial records, and family stories surrounding Mary Ann Trump, some of the most revealing evidence came from something much simpler: letters. Before she became Fred Trump's wife, before she became the mother of 5 children, and long before the Trump name became known around the world, Mary Ann was simply a teenage girl from Scotland. In 1926, when Mary Ann was only 14, another young Scottish girl named Agnes Sten won a painting competition. Her name and address appeared in a newspaper, and Mary Ann decided to write to her. That small decision created a friendship that lasted for decades. The two girls became pen pals. They wrote letters to each other while living very different lives. Eventually, they met in person in Glasgow before Mary Ann left Scotland for America. Then their lives moved in completely different directions. Mary Ann sailed across the Atlantic and began a new life in New York. Agnes went to Germany on a university scholarship. For decades, they remained separated. But Agnes kept the letters. That is what makes this part of the story so powerful. The letters were written before Mary Ann became wealthy, before she married Fred Trump, and before her family became one of the most recognizable names in America. They came from a time when she had no reason to perform for the public. She was simply Mary Ann. And decades later, those letters helped reveal a side of her life that family photographs could never show. In the 1990s, Agnes was watching a documentary about Donald Trump when she heard his mother's maiden name. She recognized it. The childhood friend she had lost touch with decades earlier was still alive. They reconnected and remained in contact until Mary Ann's death in 2000. Think about what those letters represented. They connected Mary Ann to the girl she had been before America changed her life. Before Fred,